Hello, everybody who's online. We continue with our discussion. I present a roundtable discussion, and I greet Professor Roman Jerala from National Institute of Chemistry in Ljubljana, freelance journalist Zarja Mursič, Professor Turk, University of Ljubljana, and assistant Luka Omladič, also from University of Ljubljana, and colleague, science journalist Lenart Kučić. Hello, everybody. Hello. Do we hear us and see us? Okay. Hello. So I wish you a good connection and sharp picture. Lenart, it's all yours.
And I can take over. Well, thank you all for coming to this discussion, and to all the participants that are watching us. Maybe just for the beginning, I received my booster shot yesterday, and there's no way for you to know that, but this is not my avatar. And the real me is not lying in bed somewhere. So hi all. In the first round, maybe you could just briefly introduce yourselves and what's your area of expertise, and then we go straight to the topic that I think that puzzles pretty much everybody inside scientific community, like why do people don't trust, well, let's say us, you as scientists and us as journalists, how it happened. But for the beginning, maybe just the first round and brief introduction of who you are and what you do. Maybe Mr. Jerala.
Hello, it's my pleasure to participate in this roundtable discussion. My name is Roman Jerala. I am head of Department of Synthetic Biology and Immunology at the National Institute of Chemistry. So those are the two main topics that we have been researching in our group, but we have also engaged in research connected to COVID. I'm also engaged in science communication, particularly now in COVID times, as we see that there's a big hesitancy regarding the vaccination and the attitude of the public.
Ms. Mursič.
Hi, thank you also in my name for the invite. So I'm actually also employed at the University of Ljubljana. I'm an assistant in cognitive science working in a project called Utopia, but mostly I'm a science journalist and I cover COVID-related topics and pandemic in different Slovenian media, as well as I currently work on a project of a science center in Slovenia.
And you're also a go-to person for pretty much everybody if he has any questions, including me. Mr. Omladič.
Hi, I'm a philosopher by profession. There's a bit of mistake in the official enunciation. I did work at the University of Ljubljana. Currently, I work at the Institute for Applied Ethics, my consultancy firm for the applied ethics. I was also until recently, I was a member of World Commission on Ethics of Science and Technology at UNESCO in Paris. And I do engage in scientific journalism and communication of science, particularly climate change science.
Thank you. And last but not least, Mr. Turk.
Thank you. Hello to everyone. I am professor of biochemistry at the Department of Biology at the University of Ljubljana. So my main topics are biochemistry and also toxinology. And above all, I try to communicate science by best of my abilities and try to believe people in science and in scientific findings.
And yeah, and we are also, well, we see that we are failing at that for different reasons.
Yeah.
But maybe we can start. I think that the last news that hit the headlines in Slovenia about this particular topic was the survey of Eurobarometer has shown that Slovenian public has, well, don't really have very good opinion on science and scientists. But maybe the first question would be, what do we talk about when we say that people don't trust science? Because I don't think anybody argues about, either space flight or let's say sunscreen, because we kind of believe that spaceships do fly and that we get sunburns if we don't use sunscreen. So it's also about science. But when we say that people don't trust science as scientists, what exactly do we mean by that? Maybe Mr. Omladič.
Yeah, well, of course, the question of trust is a very crucial one. But if you allow me, I would like to move the question a bit back to more fundamental issue of let's say epistemic question, or question of knowledge.
Okay.
How do we acquire knowledge of these objects, of these entities like climate change or epidemics? Because on the one hand, we don't want to say these are only theoretical objects; they're real objects. Yeah, the climate change is real. We want to stress its objectivity, and of course the pandemic is real. It's not just a theory. But on the other hand, it's not this entity, this object is not the kind of object that we encounter in our everyday life, in our everyday relation to objectivity. It's a very different kind of objectivity. For example, if we take climate change, how do we know about climate change? It was discovered by measuring the CO2 concentration in the air in 1950s. So the famous killing curve that represents the rates of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, or the notion of average global temperature, and so on and so on. These are very, very hard scientific abstractions, if you want, and you don't encounter killing curve or average temperature in everyday life. But of course, you do encounter some aspects of this objectivity of climate change. For example, you encounter hot summer or drought or something like that. So it's a different kind of objectivity, and there is a gap between those two, kind of epistemic gap between those two. One philosopher which I particularly like that writes on the climate change, Timothy Morton, uses the term hyperobjectivity. So the climate change or the climate change or the epidemics are kind of hyper objects. We as a normal people in everyday experience, we only experience certain very partial aspects of these hyper objects. But hyper objects as such can be represented by science, but even this representation is not accessible to everyone. You need to have even to the scientists to have the complete overview of hyper object. It's almost impossible today because the science is so complex. So there's this question of representation of hyper objects, if I may use this term, and this is one thing that is challenging for science educators. On the one hand, on the other hand, I kind of like the take that philosopher Timothy Morton takes. He says that it's not only science that helps us to represent this hyper object. It can also be, for example, art. There are very relevant artistic representations of climate change, for example, in literature, in representative arts, that can help us connect with that. So that's one short point. Oh, okay, I can stop here.
No, it's just because in a way you can also say that we are now bombarded. I mean, for the lay people who don't know about how to read data, for example, I think that Zarja could help me here. Even Sledilnik, for example, which is data models, data measurements, what we have for a layperson, it's almost like art. There are curves, shapes,
shapes, numbers, and so on. And what you need to make is a kind of connection between this scientific hyperobjectivity to representation of objectivity that we are used to in our everyday life, and to make this connection in a meaningful and scientifically sound sense. Because if you don't, then you get all kinds of confusion. Like in COVID, people say, "Oh, well, my neighbor didn't get COVID, even if he was in contact with this and other." Or, well, how can you talk about climate change and global warming when it's so cold today outside?
That's why a sum of anecdotes is not data.
But we must not just put this aside and say, "Oh, people don't understand."
Sure.
We must kind of accept this, that it's a different kind of objectivity, that it's a perhaps different kind of epistemic world we are living today, this world of, let's say, hyper objects.
This is a question for both, I think, Mr. Jerala and Ms. Mursič. But how do you bridge this gap? I mean, how do you, because you're both experienced in explaining the same thing over and over again. Probably you're quite tired, both of you, because you get the same questions all the time. But how do you, I mean, first, how do you motivate yourself? And can you maybe sum your experiences? What kind of method works here when you talk to the people and try to make this connection between, you know, data as art and real life situations? Maybe Ms. Mursič.
Yeah, this is a really good question that I actually, as a science journalist, ask myself literally every day. So how to present a personal experience and connect them to science and what science says and what science shows and where we are with science. And I actually don't have a good answer to that. I know that there is a few examples from abroad. So in like American media, especially, that do that really well, that go into the community, that talks with the community and then connects it to the science and through the scientists that see some kind of, let's say, an environmental impact, if we are talking about climate change on one town or something. We currently have this case now in Slovenia. It's actually in the media with, we have a small town where there used to be industry of asbestos, and there is still a lot of that because of a specific type of cancer that's connected to that. And people have their lived experiences in that town. And the problem is that now there is another company that is also ruining their environment, and they don't have access to really clean and drinking water, which is a big problem. And you have scientists, you have doctors who are saying what they currently know about all this environmental impact on these people. Then you have politics that does and does not want to fix this problem. And then you have people who see their young ones, even people in my age, dying of a very specific cancer that it's clearly in the literature, in science literature, connected to asbestos in the past. But we know that they sorted the problem out now with asbestos, but there are other toxic substances in the water there and in their environment. So we really need to make sure that these people get what they deserve. So this is access to a clean drinking water. And currently some Slovenian activists are fighting for this. And it's really important that in the media, you do connect these words together. You connect these experiences of people who are living there, who this village is their home, together with the scientific facts that, yeah, we might not know everything about these toxic substances. And maybe these ones that are now there are not cancerogenic or whatever. But in the past, these people suffered. That's why we need to change it. But sorry, I went a bit off topic. But I'm just trying to present like how, at least in climate, when we talk about climate journalism and environmental journalism, how we can connect these individual experiences with what science says. And even when science is not sure about what impact some substances might have, they can still say that there is sometimes we do have values. I mean, we always have values, and that is a right thing to do and a wrong thing to do. Somehow we can get a social consensus on that. So I think it's more of a question for social scientists, how we do that and how we communicate that kind of things. And I think that in epidemic, especially me as a science journalist and covering pandemic, this is really something that I realized, that if in the past I was reporting on, I don't know, some interesting facts about animals, which I still love to do, and I just recently, for the sake of my mental health, I wrote a story for a radio about whale poo, and I was so happy afterwards, and really, this was really like a treat for my mental health, literally, that I was writing about something else than vaccination and pandemic, because I'm tired of it, honestly. During the pandemic, I learned that we do need to listen to people's individual experiences. And yes, if our neighbor had a ill daughter and he did not get infected with COVID, that does not mean that COVID is not such a big thing and that it's not so infectious. You just need to understand. I usually try to listen to them and help them understand with a dialogue, with also taking into account their personal experience with something that science says. But this takes time and a lot of patience, and it needs to be done in a community with people, not just from. What I don't like about science communication, even the way I do it, is that it's always top down. That is like, I am the one who knows, I'm presenting you information, you are there to listen to me. And even in Slovenia, in this specific case that we found ourselves now with COVID, it's a bit more like, and please obey me, because this is what I say and I know that, which I don't think it's right, which I think it's more, I'm getting more to a part when I realize how important it is that we are within our communities and talk with our communities, which might not have a big impact. It might not seem like a big impact from a bigger media, but step by step you can actually do changes. And I think this is going to be really important in communicating climate change in the future and all this environmental impact. And we do have examples of that in Slovenia that are quite clear. You can see how it works, even if science is not clear, or it's maybe still have a lot of uncertainty about what effects might be. But we just need to be honest with public and I like to say that we need to have a dialogue, not just teaching, or not just like presenting facts to people. I hope I was clear.
Mr. Jerala, what was your learning curve? Because I knew about you beforehand, but you were not a science communicator. You were not really very visible outside of scientific community. But then you were also, your team was included in development of vaccines. And then I started following the Twitter account. And then you start explaining on Twitter the facts. But at first, it was, even for us, I think, was kind of hard to understand, because it was still a very inside knowledge to, I mean, we could read your tweets, but I can't really say that I totally understood them. But now you also became one of the go-to persons when it comes to comments. What is your experience and what was your learning curve in this sense?
Well, I have been engaged in communicating at least some scientific discoveries or some scientific interesting information for quite a long time. But of course, it hasn't been perhaps so well known outside the people who are mainly interested in science. Sure. My main motivation is really to share my enthusiasm about scientific discoveries. I think there are so many exciting things going on in science, and I think many of those are really of interest for the general public. And I think that's something that's missing in Slovenia, more higher presence of science in general media, because there are that many scientific information which can be presented in an accessible way, and then that also affects and will affect our lives in future. So that was my primary information. But of course, then during the COVID, I felt an urge to share some of the information based on science that I mainly engaged via Twitter. But of course, it's not my duty or really my goal to replace reporters. I mean, they are nowadays all also very rapidly reporting new scientific papers or new scientific information. I'm trying to present it in more, let's say, accessible way, or perhaps in a critical way, because I think we also, I see that's important, not to share everything, because everything is just too much, But of course, I think we now in the situation like that, I feel, at least myself, that we scientists also have a duty to report in a responsible way, to really not, you know, you can report some information and say, okay, for example, yesterday there was a paper that some T cells based on the previous infection by coronaviruses may provide some protection, but of course it may also have a negative impact, because people will say, of course, maybe I'm just immune because I'm intouchable. So that's something that I think needs to be taken into account. But now, of course, we know we are in a COVID crisis, and I think it's really a great threat in our society. And I think we just need to do what we can to help in a way. In a way, I have a feeling that we are failing, unfortunately, because as you said initially, the vaccination is still too low, but we certainly have to try. Regarding the methods, I mean, I think it's good to have many different voices and many different styles. I selected my own style, which is mainly anchored into the natural sciences, into the medicine. So I try to keep to this part of explaining. Sometimes perhaps it's a bit too technical, but I'm trying to relay, to convey some important information. Of course, I'm biased as a scientist, and I believe that I believe the facts, I believe the numbers, I believe the graphs, and of course, I often believe that people should be persuaded by this, because after all, this is based on lot of information. I agree with Dr. Mursič that it is very important to present information in a way that people relate. In the case studies are also very, very powerful, but from another point of view, it may be quite dangerous. And I believe that this may be perhaps responsible for the attitude, because people are more prone to trust the information that they hear from their neighbors, from somebody they know. And in the social networks, I have the feeling that people sort of treat the information that they get from the social networks. It's sort of like a gossip, or it's sort of like the first-hand information. My friend from Facebook gave me this information, and then of course I do it. And quite often I hear, okay, but how is this in Slovenia? But we are the same human beings. We have the same vaccines, the same virus. So I think we have information that's available on a large number of cases. I don't think there's a need to try it again in Slovenia. And I think this is one of the problems nowadays. Like the famous rap singer Nicki Minaj said, "I did my own research." I mean, that's not research. That's part of the problem. But that people think they need to be persuaded. I'm really I prefer the scientific method, because it is really has been trusted. There are many, of course, errors. The virus is new. We don't know anything, but still, I think that's something that we have to rely. And of course, I'm perhaps a bit too long, but just to the final point, I think it is really important to try also for the future to sort of try to promote the scientific point of view, because all us scientists have experienced failures. We made hypotheses, and when the facts turn out that's not the case, we just reject the hypothesis. And that's something that ordinary people in everyday life have a difficult time to do. They trust they're within certain frame of mind, and it's very difficult to reject it and to go to something different. For us scientists, it is easier. Of course, I love my hypotheses that were, if I have worked on it for 10, 20 years, but if the facts prove me wrong, then I say, okay, too bad, but I will try another way. And I think that's something, a message that science can now in the crisis, but also in the future, give to the public and try to promote this point of view.
Thank you. Mr. Turk, you are the scientist yourself, but you're also an educator. And during this pandemic, you heard quite a few criticisms on like, is our education system failing because people seem, well, to forget or not to know or not to internalize even the most basic facts about either scientific methods or like how immune system works, why vaccine work, or it can be pretty much, I think, seen in every other context. How is that? I mean, why are we failing this most basic concept? And as Mr. Jerala says, if you want to do your own research, you need to be familiar with these scientific methods, at least up to a point that you know that you have a hypothesis, then you need to have a method, then you need to get the information or the data, then to analyze them and then see whether they work or not. But it seems like a very basic principles, but in society, it seems to be lacking.
Yeah, you are right. Because science is not only about the research, but it's also about the dissemination of science and to let people know how the science works. So it's not only about the facts that the science produces, and also the proven facts, and also those that were somehow the hypotheses that were refuted. But in general, it's definitely important that we make people believe that the science works by scientific method and what the scientific method is. So let me put by other words, it's not important to learn more, for example, about biology or astronomy or physics, but it's important to explain how the entire science works. What is the method that it uses in science? So the school system in our country, it's still working somehow, but on the other hand, if I now return to the today pandemics in information that I name infodemics, and of course within this infodemic, the COVID pandemic, takes a significant part of it. So this infodemics nowadays makes the findings of serious science equal to all kinds of disinformation and misinformation that flow from all kinds of websites and channels directly into circulation within the social media networks. And therefore, a plethora of information and disinformation and misinformation is mixed into a conglomerate of different beliefs and trusts, and basically it's available to everyone. And therefore, the common public, the ordinary people, have difficulties to sort all this kind of information out. And then additional problem, in my opinion, is that when this information flows into the social media, the social bubbles are created. And with these social networks, this disinformation and misinformation that has equal weight as scientific information spreads among these bubbles very fast. So people who spread this all kind of information in these social bubbles, within these social bubbles, they feel important because their opinion counts. And also they believe that they are safe and righteous despite the fact that these opinions are based on totally fabricated stories and misused data. So to make these people believe that science has questions, of course, but it also has answers to important aspects of their everyday life, is becoming more and more difficult. So this is something that the scientists and we as scientists that we have to cope with, and this is not always easy, as, for example, my colleague Roman can tell you.
Yeah, sure.
So,
I mean,
maybe just one final thought about this. So if the scientific facts are not communicated in a clear and easy understandable way for general public, many will rather believe a false but simple claim that it easily spreads within their social bubbles. And this is, I think, a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, social psychology tells us that that's all a symptom of so-called tribal thinking, when it becomes more important, like which tribe do you belong to, than what are the facts. And yesterday when I went to, well, take my booster, I also did a tiny anthropological research, and I asked people around me and the staff, and they told me that, like, most of the people there are people who came for the third dose, and there are only very few people who came for the first one. And those who came for the first one are sometimes those who already had COVID, but wanted to extend their PCT certificate. So it was a pragmatic thought. But basically what we see is like we're stuck at 50%, no matter the data. And one of the terms that's also used to describe this is politicization. Maybe question for Mr. Omladič, how does this politicization happen when we start thinking in tribal terms? Because today we're discussing the two most politicized topics in science, vaccines and environment. And as I said, we're not talking about all the science.
Sorry. Well, we have to recognize that we are on a kind of intersection between epistemology, knowledge, and the politics when we talk about climate change or epidemics. It's a real crossroad, and I think perhaps the climate change science was the first field that kind of realized the real political consequences of the knowledge it presents, because it basically says that this knowledge, if you accept this knowledge, it implies that you have to change the world.
Sure.
It's enormous. The consequences are enormous. And if you appeal to somebody that he must change the world, then there must be a strong position, a strong trust in the knowledge that you present. Otherwise, this will seem like, well, why should I change my ways? Why should I change the world just because the scientist says that? So again, the different types of political forces learned how to use uncertainties, new uncertainties on this intersection of politics and science. And for example, one such uncertainty that they use is a notion of scientific uncertainty. Of course, scientific uncertainty is a building stone of science. On the one hand, it kind of quantifies the type of certainty, the type of result you get. On the other hand, the scientific uncertainty points to the areas where new research is needed, and so on and so on. But in case of climate science, at least in the, let's say, in the 1990s, where the so-called climate skepticism was very strong, there were some political forces, and we can name those forces. These were forces connected with the interest of industry of fossil fuels. They didn't want. They probably still don't want to change the world.
Or their business model.
Yeah, or their business model. So they needed to plant the kind of doubt in a science, and they used the scientific uncertainty, which is kind of integral part of a scientific method, and they translated it in a kind of unhealthy skepticism. And they said, okay, science is not certain, you must always doubt in science, there's one science that says this, another science that says that, and so on. And they use the method of cherry picking, which is, by the way, very again popular in the COVID situation. You take just one study. Dr. Jerala mentioned this. You take just one study, and then you kind of, okay, but this study says this. So cherry picking confused the fact that that science is consensual in its basics. So that there is a need to present a scientific consensus on certain topics, and that this scientific consensus is something that provides the basis for the trust and for the appeal that the science does to the public. To confuse scientific uncertainty with a kind of banal skepticism on the one hand, and to confuse cherry picking with scientific consensus. This was the main method that some forces used, at least in the case of climate science, to discredit its authority.
Yeah, and one of the pioneers are the big tobacco.
Yeah, they were the same. They used the same experts that migrated from a tobacco industry to climate to fossil fuels industry. I haven't read the more deep analysis of the COVID situation, but we hear that there are also some concrete interest connected with producing the doubt in a scientific consensus on COVID.
Yeah, we can see that, and we can see a lot of
people make money from this. Selling vitamins or things like that.
It's always following the money. You can, and also I've learned that, for example, the darknet is really happy about this huge demand for ivermectin, and that it's now possible to buy it for cryptocurrency or other ways, but you don't even know if you're getting the real thing. Not to mention, are you using the real thing, right?
But just one other thing that perhaps there will be opportunity to speak about this later. But in this intersection of science and politics, we must never take the moral high ground, and this is very important. I think this is what Dr. Mursič also mentioned earlier. So there are ethical questions, there are questions of justice, of equality, and so on. So to take the high moral ground, it's never efficient, even in this situation of confusion, even in this situation of produced confusion.
Yeah, but this is, I think, very important, and I'll ask Ms. Mursič and others to address it, because what we've seen in our society is first you have science and scientific ideas, and we have politics. And of course, you can say that you can debate about, the use and effectiveness of vaccines. That's one question. But then there's the other question. If you impose, let's say, social and political measures that actually creates a caste system between those who are vaccinated who are not. And this is important. If you use science as a kind of argument or reason for political decision, that's also one of the ways to politicize science. And maybe Ms. Mursič, how do you make a distinction between the two, to say, yes, of course, science works. You do not abuse, theory of conspiracy theories or this unhealthy skepticism in order to prove that there's something wrong with the vaccines or whatever, and how to still be critical to this idea that your citizen and human rights are sort of dependent on whether you take a vaccine or not.
Thank you for this question. I think it's a really complicated question that I don't have answer to. I don't have answer to that, but I do think that science is political, that science cannot be not political, because science is made by humans, and humans live in a society, and we grew up in a specific society, and we have specific values, we have specific beliefs. So we cannot do our science without this. I think, and from the literature I follow, maybe more on a social sciences part, I think this is a fact. Like we cannot not do that. I mean, I really like a quote from my favorite, probably one of my favorite science journalists who recently wrote, and I'm just gonna read it because I think it's a really good quote. And if you don't mind, so science, what he says, this is Ed Young, he's a British science journalist, but he writes for The Atlantic. And what he says is, science is often caricatured as a purely empirical and objective pursuit. But in reality, a scientist's interpretation of the world is influenced by the data she collects, which are influenced by the experiments she designs, which are influenced by the questions she thinks she thinks to ask, which are influenced by her identity, her values, her predecessors, and her imagination. So, and I do think it is like that, and I think we need to be honest about that. And I think it was very important when Dr. Jerala said that we do live in our social networks, we have our own biases, and we follow them, and usually there are biases, who do we follow and how. And I think we just need to honestly talk about it. But I think your question was in a different way, like how to still have science and still trust science or follow the science. And I think the answer is that I recently spoke with one of the former science advisors to British government. I had an interview with her, and I think I got a clear picture of how do they do it in the UK and what would I want to see in Slovenia. So they do have these independent science advisors that are civil servants that are employed there to be some kind of a translators between the policymakers and the scientists. But what is the most important thing in comparison to Slovenia is that they have a tradition of this. So they've been doing this since Second World War, basically. So they are used to this. And scientists also know, okay, we can synthesize, we can translate the data for you, but at the end of the day, it's policymakers who decide what kind of policies they're going to make, and the politicians who will either follow the science or not. But because of that tradition that they have in the UK system, politicians need to follow science most of the time, and they don't follow it, and it's not ideal at all. I'm not being I don't think that it's ideal, and even the science advisor then even resign when they see that they cannot do that, which is not like a practice in Slovenia when not scientists but experts now in experts group, where I don't know, I found it quite strange that they are changing the minutes after the meetings to fit with the political ideas at the time. So I think we need to. Yeah, it's a huge. This happened in Slovenia, maybe for a context. Basically, the expert group said something, and it was in the media, and then they said that they changed the minutes, or that the minutes were wrong from the meeting, so the media didn't understand correctly, or something along these lines. Something about the current situation with COVID, and I think this is a big problem where we are losing the trust in science and in expert groups and in everything. And we need at least for Slovenian example, we would need like some kind of a reset and start with the tradition of science advisors and understanding what their role is and how they are connected to policy making. And one other thing I would like to stress just now, which actually relates to the conversation we had before, we were talking about us being scientists and them being ordinary people, which I think is wrong. I'm an ordinary person if I talk about the discipline that Dr. Omladič covers. You are a philosopher, and I have no clue about philosophy. So when it comes to that, I'm the ordinary person listening about philosophy. I'm not a scientist, even so I do have a science degree. So I think this is really important, that we need to understand that us as a scientist, we don't have a right to talk about other disciplines of science because we are lay people when it comes to other disciplines of science. And yeah, I don't know. These are all the questions that I ask myself on a daily basis, especially what you ask me, how to separate the science from politics and how to communicate science. What even is science communication in this world now? And what does it need to include and entail in the future when we will be faced with climate change? We are already faced with climate change, and it's going to be tough to present to people, and we can't just count on them that we will present some numbers about temperatures rising, sea level rising, and people will just change their behaviors because they will see, oh my God, yeah, it's really bad. That's not going to happen. We need to do it differently, and we need to figure out creative and innovative ways on how to do this.
Yeah, you're making very important point, because I usually say that communication of science, even for scientists, begins, at the lab next door. because we are so specialized that if we want to explain like each other's research, it takes us all the skills that we need for communicating with, let's say, the lay public. Maybe a question for both Mr. Jerala and Mr. Turk. I talked to one of your colleagues very recently, and he's very active at Slovenian, and he's also using a lot of his time to address those issues. But he says, you know, I can hardly wait for a phone call from our national research agency when they'll ask me, well, what have you done as a scientist in this last 2 years? And I will say, well, according to your criteria, nothing. Is it also a part of the problem that whatever you do as a scientist does not really count as scientific work if it goes to, let's say, public speeches, explaining to people, writing not just scientific articles, but maybe some books or presentations that try to address and explain those issues? Is it also a problem that there is no systemic stimulation or recognition for this part of your work, Mr. Jerala?
Well, I wouldn't put it like that. I mean, I think it's a benefit. It's something that I think is and should be appreciated by reviewers, but it's not something that will completely complement your basic work. I agree that it's important, but of course, after all, for your career, you can't just say I just communicated in those 2 years. Although this is certainly, I think, certainly has some value. So I think, of course, there are some people who are, I would say, perhaps professional science communicators, and I think it's good to encourage scientists to do it more and more often. But I just think that it has to come from within yourself. So you have to find the urge to really communicate. And there are lots of others, even in younger generations. I see also at our institute, there are some younger people who are just so excited about science, about these communications. And the institute, of course, is encouraging this. But I think, of course, this can't be a substitute to say, okay, instead of the project that I got funding for, those 2 years I have been just communicating science, but I don't think that's what you're suggesting.
No, I'm not saying that it should be either or, but
of course, I think it's good to try to encourage this. A couple of years ago, we had some sort of obligation that each of the research groups has to do some science communication, but I don't think that this really resulted in much more science communication than in general. Yeah, I don't really have an answer how to improve this, but I think we certainly have much more science communication. After all, there are some channels that enable this. I mean, Twitter also has some dark sides, but there are many good sides from Twitter. I also personally get a lot of information based on just pure science on some new papers, some new discoveries outside of my field that I can use, and I think this is something that is increasing science communication nowadays also.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Turk, do you think it could be, or there is a role of institutions? Because maybe if I, again, aside from my own experience, it's the same goes for journalism. If you say, or your editors would of course like your stories to be better and in depth, but they would not give you more time to do so. And that's why it's kind of hard to have a career in science journalism in Slovenia, because hardly any medium would hire you only to do that. And if it's just one of your side activities and you need to fill, the social media and all other stuff, you cannot really do in-depth stories. So institutional support here is very important. Is the same or similar in science?
Well, judging for the space, for example, some of the newspapers are given to science, and I know that nowadays newspapers are not anymore the most important source of spreading science. But anyway, for example, in Delo, we know that we have 2 pages per week. On the other hand, we have a cultural page every day. But I don't want to say that culture is doing better than science nowadays in Slovenia. Institutions, of course, they have the PRs mostly now employed. Also, somehow the occupation of science communicator is nowadays becoming probably an important part of course of communicating of science from the institution, going out to the journalists that are writing about science. But in general, as I said, I think that for scientists themselves, of course, scientists are perceived as sometimes a bit weird people that mostly like to sit in their cabinets or doing works in the laboratory, but not speaking with the general public about the results and explaining the results of their research. And I think that this will change from time, because today it's make no doubt that it's equally important to do research and to disseminate the research, because also in the project that and grants, they require actually dissemination. You have to, when you write a project, you have to pay attention to dissemination of the results of this work. So I don't know. I just believe that that communication of science must find different channels to reach as much people as possible. And maybe just one reply to Dr. Mursič about the ordinary people. Of course, we are all ordinary people, and we all live in some kind of social bubbles by ourselves. We are not exception. But maybe this was misunderstood. But I think that what's going on today is that common public is more prone to listen to all kind of unproved misinformation, or even deliberately launched disinformation instead of science, because science is hard. Let's not make science is not fun. You know, this concept that science is fun is false. You know, science is a hard work. It's sometimes very demanding, sometimes it's rewarding, but many times it's disappointing. So science is not fun, and sharing this perception of science in public does not make a lot of good things for the perception of science. So it's what is fun is really disinformations are fun, because this sometimes it's hard to believe what kind of things are flowing from the internet and from the social media.
May I just add on science communication or science journalism? Of course, I was referring before to the scientists who is not the main work to do the science communication. It's something that needs to be part of the work, but of course, it's something completely different for science journalism and science. And in this case, the serious media, of course, have specialist scientists who are just covering science. But of course, it's something different for New York Times, for example, who have a couple of specialists who do this and do excellent work. And I think it would be great, but to do something like that in Slovenia. But of course, as we know, the journals are really facing difficult times. But I'm still again and again trying to repeat that more science should enter the media. Radio is nicely covered, like Frequenza X is really great, and there are many other similar journals. But of course, science should really come into the main news, like 2 minutes of science information per day. And of course, for this, professionals should be hard to take care of this, and this should then, of course, promote science. After all, science and technology is and will even more in the future shape our lives. After all, science is really basic science literacy is really required, particularly for decision makers, because they will have to make decisions, and if it's difficult to make good decisions if you're not do not understand the advice that is given to you by scientific councils. I also completely agree that this tradition of scientific advisors should be elevated, should be stressed, and more to really cover more substance. I have been part of the how is it called, Council for Science and Technology, that is supposed to advise to the government, but in reality it is more like, you know, like the network for discussions without of really being asked by government for science advices. When governments also, our government of course takes some advices, but of course it would be great to be more independent advice. But of course, in the final decision has to take into account many different aspects, not just particular part, but of course it should really be based on good scientific advice.
Yeah, probably it should be reversed, because what we see now, as Ms. Mursič also mentioned, is that politics still sees science mostly as something, you know, to legitimize political decisions. Like, we want to do that, now we need a scientific or scientists to support that idea. It's not the other way around. Let's let's first get the data, get the advices, and then decide what to do. We don't have this tradition yet.
Yeah, may I just
sure.
step in? Maybe just what Roman said. I mean, science and politics. You have experienced how many representatives were listening to your presentation in the parliament.
Mm-hmm.
So this tells everything how politics is interested in science. It's not, except when they need the proof for their decisions and support for their decisions. Yeah?
Yeah, you don't really get elected because of that, or you don't lose elections because of your attitude to science, unfortunately. Maybe a question, question for Luka.
Well, I just wanted to add one observation, that also the scientist is not one species animal.
Sure.
And this is really important sometimes on this intersection of science and politics. For example, in Slovenia, we had in the 90s, it was very popular for scientists or experts for some other field than the climate science, or completely other field than climate science, engineering or something else, to make a very public, very categoric statement on the climate change. Usually they denied the consensus of climate change, and they were given the space in the media as a scientist. So this is something that we really have to watch for, and this is the task of the not just scientific journalists, but the editor of the pages of scientific of journal that gives space to the scientist.
Yeah, and we see the same with, you know, with legal experts or with medical or with doctors, because if somebody is a legal expert, he can comment pretty much everything, you know, from a divorce to constitutional law in media. Yeah, that's Zarja.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to this whole debate now. I think we also need to separate from science promotion or promoting science and science communication, science journalism.
Sure.
These things are different. So and I also don't think that if you're a scientist, working scientist, that you necessarily need to communicate your research with general public, because this is not part of the being a scientist. I mean, it's great if you do it, but it's not one of the requests for you as a professional scientist to do it.
And it's a skill.
And it's a skill, that you can develop. And I really like the fact that most of younger colleagues of mine, they are getting training in that. There are workshops offered also in Slovenia, more and more of that on different courses that they can attend, and they can learn and develop these skills with it. And I also hope that we will enable them to do that in a science center when we get to it. But what I wanted to say, that it's important that the institutions, they need to promote their science. is the way science works, basically, that they write press releases and then journalists pick up the press releases. But I think also the science through press releases did a lot of damage throughout the pandemic, because there was not enough data available that you could check the facts, that you could check the data, that you could run the analysis with the data that they provide, which is what science communicators or science journalists can do, because usually in UK and in the States, they are a trained scientists who then change the career to go into the communication. So they can sometimes take the data of the studies, they can run their own analysis. And it did happen in the past that science journalists or science communicators found the mistakes in the data, and they started the process of some studies and things like that. So we need to talk about that as well. So yeah, unfortunately in Slovenia we don't have that kind of people or science communicators that would have enough time to just focus on the scientific stories and bring that kind of science closer to the public.
Sure, it's not yet a career. And maybe
I think it's important that we.
Sorry, I just want to also make another distinction.
I just wanted to say that it's really important to share. Yeah.
I just wanted to make another distinction that there's also a difference between science journalism and promoting of science, because sometimes even scientific community, for example, sometimes journalists who write about science are seen by scientific community as promoters of science, but our role is journalistic. So it means, yeah, sure, I mean, giving correct information, but also be critical. It doesn't mean that we are totally pro-science or otherwise. Or pro-science institutions, or it often gets confused also. But maybe another question when it comes to this situation, I listened to a podcast quite recently, and it was about, I think, anthropological study among American evangelicals. And they wanted to know, like, why there are so many, let's say, denialists, especially when it comes to climate change among this specific group. And I was surprised to find an answer that they said, well, if you believe in God and if you believe that God knows what's best of us and God has a plan, then this idea that we as poor, humble humans can actually change the course of the planet by using, science and our own limited brains, it's like pretentious. So if you are a real believer, then you don't doubt God's decisions and you don't try to fight against it. So to me, it was like, whoa, that's new for me. That's an interesting insight. But how do you deal with that? I mean, if you not only mix science and politics, but also start mixing science and religion, as there is one of the criticisms then from 19th century on, science started to replace religion in many ways.
Well, by this kind of arguing, then you can also say we cannot do anything about Holocaust and other atrocities. It's just what the God wants. I mean, this is ultimately stupid and dangerous. So that's a simple answer to this dilemma. But I think, we really should not speak about American evangelists because they have all kinds of stupid ideas.
But Mr. Omladič, for example, because the same goes for myths. You don't really argue whether one myth is real or not, because we know it's a myth, it's not real, but it's a matter of whether a myth is alive or not, because if a myth is alive, then it exists and it influences our being.
Yeah, I mean, I personally am not religious, so I can only reflect this from the outside point of view. But well, I know that there are, even in American evangelical community, there are scientists, there are climate scientists that are that strongly communicate the need for engagement in a fight against climate change. So I wouldn't be so categorical about religion being as such an obstacle for fighting the climate change or not. It's a question perhaps of the members of the particular religious community to use the right approach. And I think basically every I mean, at least as a religion, most of the religion, probably all religions, have a certain self-understanding that they're ethical. Their ultimate goal is to promote certain types of ethical behavior. So I think if you know how to connect to this sentiment, to this self-understanding of religious person that he wants to act ethically, then this can even be a strong vehicle for promoting the climate change awareness. And we can see this, as I said, there are certain personalities from science community in American evangelicals. There is, for example, in Catholic Church, Pope had an encyclical on the climate change and so on. So I think it's a matter of engagement and finding the right connection to the ethical sense of the religious community.
No, I agree. I didn't want to mock religion in any way, but for me, it's like opened a new frame. So maybe with those people, if they're religious, you could maybe argue in a different way. Like, why do you think that then God created scientists that are now publishing this data?
And it's different from theology to theology. For example, the Catholic theology connected with this sense of human being the guardian of the creation. This is kind of a Catholic theological moment. But I think other religions, for example, some types of Buddhist religion have this sense of interconnectedness of the different beings and so on. So there are many ways to connect and to use the religious sentiment to promote.
Mr. Jerala wanted to add something.
If I can perhaps translate it to something that's perhaps closer to our cultural view or field. This attitude towards vaccines didn't fall on empty ground, so it built on some previous resentments or the presence of quasi science in media, homeopathy in national media, bioresonance and things like that, and the new age feeling that I know best my own body, which is non-scientific approach, and I think this then bred the response that people just don't want the vaccines. For example, genetically modified organisms, the science is clear on that topic, but in Europe it became like politically correct to be against, to just accept the public attitude towards GMOs, and nobody touches it, although the science is clear on that of course you have to treat it case by case, that GMO modifications can do a lot of good things also for the environment, but still there are many people. And I think it's sort of the same circle. I'm not saying that just GMO should be equal with vaccines, but of course there are some people are claiming that vaccines are modifying your genome, and this is certainly very strong feeling, and that perhaps is scaring some people against the use of vaccines.
Yeah, and when you say GMOs, I read a very interesting article recently, a while ago. It was, I think, one of the art historians used, I think, paintings from different era, especially when painters painted like still life, with fruits, vegetables, and models and flowers. And they saw like that most vegetables looked very differently 200 or 300 years ago that they look now from just according from that painting. So I mean, we're surrounded by GMOs anyway. So it's another thing that Zarja, that we don't take into account.
I would just go back to this question about religion, because it's but to vaccines actually. So in 2014-15, and then in 2018, the Vaccine Confidence Project. This is a research project led by Heidi Larsson. She's an anthropologist who studies vaccine confidence and vaccine hesitancy. Did a study in European Union countries about vaccine confidence, and Slovenia was on the lower part of vaccine confidence. So we don't have high vaccine confidence, especially in 2015. And then to 2018, we actually improved during that time. And the question that improved, or where the change came from, was the question about religion, whether you have religion reasons not to use vaccines. So somehow in these 3 years, because the National Health Institute knew about these results, because it's a European Commission project, basically, they did something that changed the attitude towards this question about that there are religious reasoning not to take vaccines, which is quite interesting. So there are ways to change it. I have no idea what they did because I didn't explore it and how, but it did even change in our community. But what I want to say about this, like, yeah, there might be this religious group that say, okay, yeah, climate change and God created us, climate change is just part of the process. I also know people who are not religious and think that climate change are just part of the process and it's gonna happen and they don't want to change. So I think it's really, we really shouldn't see people as monoliths, but there is a lot of diversity among them and diversity of views. And I also know people who don't trust the scientific consensus that there is an anthropogenic climate change, but still act and change their behavior in terms of reducing the carbon footprint, having electric cars, and I don't know, using public transport, cycling to work, recycling, and all these things that they want to have solar roof and stuff, and they don't actually think that humans are a cause of it. So like, it's really hard to understand. Like, you really need to see all this diversity in how people see things, and it's not easy. So, and we need to give answer to all these people as science communicators, and when we communicate, and we also need to listen to them. That's the only thing I wanted to say. So
yeah, basically we need some kind of consensus of the, let's say, a big plan, and then go for this idea of whatever works for whoever in trying to achieve that. I think that we have time for one.
Yeah, exactly.
Final...
That's what I wanted.
I think we have time for one final round of questions, and of course it will be a speculative one, and of course it will not be easy. But if you had like one wish or one idea in how to, let's say, fight this narrative and actually fight this virus and not totally destroy this earth in the next few decades, what would it be? What would be maybe one speculative or wishful answer for addressing most of the topics or some of the topics that we opened today? And maybe Mr. Turk, I know it's a tough one, I know.
Yeah, maybe for answering that one, I should make a step back and just to explain, because we started with this Eurostat survey, and maybe the Velikan questionnaire of Slovenian public opinion from 2018 to 2020 was asking respondents who they trust the most among the occupation. And the scientists were placed third by public trust, being at that time only surpassed by medical nurses and farmers, which is quite understandable. Okay. But in the last year and a half, and during the pandemics, this last Eurostat questionnaire showed an enormous change in perception of science and scientists among respondents from Slovenia. And what is really surprising and worrisome is that the questionnaire showed that Slovenians believe the scientists are immoral and corrupted, which put us to the shameful first place within European nations in this regard. And this is really not nice. In addition, in Slovenia, only 27% of respondents attribute positive characteristics to scientists, which is also the least in the European Union. So these findings are definitely hard to explain because, I mean, what happened in just 1.5 years that we plundered from the top of the public trust to the lowest level. And I have a very simple actually answer to that. Because during the COVID crisis, the social climate changed abruptly. And since this COVID pandemic is deeply linked to health and science, and therefore its explanation and solutions are offered also to the government. And besides COVID is, of course, we know that it's equally an economic, social, and political problem. And since this later, so the politics, the government, failed to address it correctly, and in Slovenia this is beyond any doubt that it was so, and it still is. And meanwhile, side by side, the politics grabbed all power and also somehow kidnapped the social subsystem. The trust to the government handling and the epidemics plundered, and this goes along with science in this particular regard of COVID. Now, what to do in the future to improve this situation? This is hard to answer. I think that the pandemics itself will eventually, as we know from the past pandemics and epidemic situation, will somehow lose its grip to the world population because of the vaccination, because of the like other infectious diseases, but I think it's possible that such pandemics will occur also in the future. And I think that for the next, we will be better prepared, because at least now we have some experience how to handle this. We handle this poorly in Slovenia, but in general, the world will learn something. And since it will learn something, it will have better chances to cope with future pandemics and the situations in which we are right now. So,
thank you, Mr. Jerala.
Yeah, so just a comment to Tom's worries about those percentages. At least I see explanation that people were looking science as or scientists as those that were forbidding that they were introducing some restrictions that were preventing people to live their normal lifestyle, that were sort of asking them to be vaccinated, although they don't want to be vaccinated. And I at least I see that that's the reason why science really dropped in type of respectability in general. But I would just like to share my really one of the main worries for the future, I think, are social networks. I really think that they are really presenting an existential threat for Slovenia, Europe, for the whole world, because I mean, I saw yesterday a very nice movie on Arte, Engineers of Chaos. I mean, the degree of disinformation, the really sort of, I mean, those social media are engineered in a way that they are spreading fear, that they are spreading hatred, that they are spreading sort of the short, that they are not really urging people to think in long terms, but short, very, very catchy decisions. They are a threat to democracy, and I'm sure that we will just have to regulate and really shape them, because I really think it's not just the social networks, but they're really the source of one of the main reasons for bad handling of pandemics, because those disinformation and organization of people who don't want to change anything is originating from this type of. And it, as we heard from a couple of, I think, months or weeks ago, it's ingrained in the design. You know, with that they just want the corporations are just want to earn money, but of course politicians are also using it for their benefit. I think it's something that we'll just have to handle in some way.
Thank you, Ms. Mursič.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to this, but I think this is a really interesting point also about social network. I was just listening. I just read a thing about how in States and also in the UK, where the main language is English, they are actually quite good at detecting disinformation and flagging it. While if it comes to in the States, they have this problem to Spanish communities, to Latino communities, then there is a lot of spread of misinformation, especially because the way the algorithms work, they don't detect the Spanish language and disinformation on that field. So I think think in Slovenia we have the same problem, that there is 2 million people speaking Slovenia. These corporations are not interested in sorting this out for us. So I think this is a big problem. But I would like to, I like the fact that Dr. Turk had some hope for the future. And I would also say this, that I think about a human species as my PhD is in evolutionary anthropology, and I like human evolution, and I think, and also comparative psychology, and seeking for what makes us human is a question that I like to ask myself. And one of the things that we really do well is mind traveling, and we can travel in the past and in the future, and we can imagine different futures. And I really hope that we would use this capacity on a global level to step together and actually overcome this climate crisis together, and without actually excluding any of the communities in the world that will be impacted the most. But I don't know, this is just my young, hopeful view of the future, but I don't know if this is going to happen. And I'm going to try to communicate stuff to people, still communicate stuff to people, that to enable them to create this future that I want to have.
Yeah, it's just reminded me of one very old quote: that the only thing that history teaches us, that history teaches us nothing. And I really hope this quote is wrong. But to conclude with Luka, but with taking a long view of not learning much, what do you think?
I will misuse one old philosophical metaphor. That's Plato's metaphor of ship, of a state as a ship. So he presents us with this vision of this picture of a ship where the owner of the ship is blind. Mm-hmm. The sailors are incompetent and stupid, and they just fight between each other who will run the ship. And there is one person that observes the stars, that measures the currents of the water and so on, the only person who knows how to run the ship, and he's regarded as a lunatic. Yeah, and of course, in a Plato's analogy, the ship is the state, the blind owner is the people, the sailors are politicians, and the lunatic that observes the stars is the scientist. Well, now the Plato's conclusion is that you need the change, you need the scientists to become the kings, and only when the scientists will become the kings, you will have the healthy and just society. And I would put it other way around. Plato would not agree with me, but I would say, and I would conclude with that it's possible that you need the opposite, that you need the just, democratic, equal society to have the respect for the scientists, and to have the ship being run in a rational and sound way. So I think the healthy society, the just, democratic, the equal society is what is needed to improve the confidence in science and the positive interaction between science and society. Without that, only the ship just goes, like sometimes we observe in these days, somewhere towards the rocks.
Yeah, that everybody fails to see because they're so busy arguing with everything. Thank you all. I think this was a very interesting discussion. I really hope that also our audience liked it. Yeah, I'm also hoping that at least when it comes to data, I don't think that any other pandemic ever in history was so well documented as this one, and that in a few years' time we'll have quite a lot of answers on how to deal with it, and hope that we'll use these answers to better navigate through new pandemics that we also know that if you combine, virology and climate science, we pretty much know that they will happen, and we just don't know how bad it'll be. Thank you. And we're leaving this panel to our other colleagues.
Bye.
Thank you, Lenart, especially to your colleagues, Zarja, Roman, Tom, and last but not least, Luka, who gave us at the end a kind of a hope, a slice of hope, belief, and last but not least, the knowledge to face the challenges that await for us regarding these topics in the future. Thank you to everybody who participated in this discussion, in this debate, and bye-bye.